because one of the things that we had kind of discussed, right? I was able to go to see The Iron Claw, which
I'm going to
is
see it Friday. Don't spoil it for me.
I'm not going to spoil it, but it's fantastic. Fantastic movie. I would love to do a review on this next episode or whatever, but it's a fantastic movie.
I'm down.
And it begged the question of what other wrestlers should have a wrestling biopic. One of the most popular names was Eddie Guerrero. But on the flip side of that, there was a discussion of Chris Benoit receiving a biopic. And the reactions were really, really mixed, because if you know anything about Chris Benoit, you know that his passing was very unfortunate, and it affected, and in the midst of his passing, he affected negatively the livelihood and the well-being of other people. So I wanted to know, would it be appropriate for Chris Benoit to receive his own biopic?
Okay. So, me as a fan, I would like to see it, but is it appropriate necessarily? That's subjective. But I understand both points, and I want to throw that out there. I understand that entails addressing the double murder suicide, and it's not so much the suicide part that people have an issue with, but obviously the loss of Nancy and his first child.
Yeah.
So that being said, I understand people don't want to see that murder reenacted. I could completely understand that. I know that a lot of people forever will hate him, and I completely understand, because you a man's supposed to be a protector and a provider, and he did not do any protection. Okay, I get it. However, Dark Side of the Ring was so fascinating to a lot of people. It got us through the pandemic. I know it got me through the pandemic. And there's just like an array of like dark things that goes behind the scenes with wrestling that we all found really interesting and very enticing. And Chris Benoit did get his own episode, and that was controversial then. I'm a fan of Chris Benoit and his work. I don't support what he did in any shape, form, or fashion, but I liked how in Dark Side of the Ring they unpacked like a little bit about himself, his upbringing, what went on in the where was his mental state, like, in progression, and how it deteriorated through use of steroids, CTE, depression from the loss of Eddie. They try to dabble as much as they could in 45 minutes. And what I was getting overall from the gist of how they describe Chris Benoit, what every person that had their own take was that they were saying he was a very good person from all their perspectives, and that this really was out of character and happened out of the blue. So my fascination in wanting a biopic is not so much that I want to see the double murder suicide. I'm not, I could politely turn my head away from that. But I'm interested in like them unpacking more about him and the type of person he was, and maybe how deep his relationship was with Eddie. I know they touched upon it in Dark Side of the Ring. I'm more so interested in the psychology of who Benoit was and getting a full understanding instead of hearing all these pieces I've been hearing for years and years and years, as I, as a fan, try to connect the dots as to how did it really come down to this. And I want to see how they capture that much about Chris Benoit. Because I feel like forever we just ingrained that he's just a murderer, which he is.
He is, yeah.
A murderer. Okay, where no one's denying that. However, I feel like there's a way you can maneuver this where it could be a little bit more educational. But again, if people don't want to see it, I get it. If there's outrage, I get it. If it rubs people the wrong way, I get it, because the first thing my brain thinks of is what's the name of that famous serial killer that got a Netflix special? Was it Netflix? I don't know.
Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yes. Yeah, that pissed off a lot of people. because I don't even think the family got consent of the victims that were killed. They didn't get any consent, and they just saw it, and it blew out because people love watching murders. I mean, I'm guilty of watching forensic interrogations and murder scenes and crimes and stuff like that. I have a weird fascination with forensics. Okay, um, so maybe that's why I'm a little bit more okay with it. And I'm just
Mm-hmm.
wondering, well, if people looked at it from maybe that light, we watch random murder cases on TV all the time. Is it really that bad if we got a biopic? Because we seem to digest that stuff just fine,
Mm-hmm.
and binge watch those things continuously. I know that as wrestling fans, we get very passionate and connected with these wrestlers. We for some reason we just like to live vicariously through them, and we feel like we're invited into their homes. Um, so maybe that's why the outrage is what it is. But I'm just like thinking about it. If we didn't know who Chris Benoit was, and he was just another like case that appeared on TV, because he did get several specials when the murder happened. He got like little 30-minute explanations as to how a WWE wrestler did such and such. So I'm like, if we kind of digested it that way and just looked at it from that lens, would we have the same outrage, or is this because we just know too much
Mm.
and we take it personally because we're fans? There's so many ways to like look at it, and it's such a touchy subject. I'm gonna say overall, I'm okay with it, but I want to hear your perspective, Jordan, entirely on this.
So before I get to like my concrete answer of if I'm okay with it, I think context in this sense is important. I feel like the reason why this is such a sticky subject is that traditionally in American cinema, biopics or biofilms serve as celebrations for people who they are doing the movie about.
Mm.
Notorious B.I.G. had a biopic. Whitney Houston, Selena, all of these people are massively adored. And so
Mm.
when they tell these stories or when they are given these biopics, usually these movies serve as celebrations for the people that the movie is being done about. Chris Benoit is such a peculiar figure that because of how good he was in the ring, even if you were to approach this from a standpoint of we're telling a story and we're not celebrating the human, it's hard because of how great he was in the ring. It's almost like you can't tell the Chris Benoit story without mentioning how great of a wrestler that he was. And if you mention how great of a wrestler he was, it's going to feel as if he was celebrated. And that, I think, in lies the issue, is that do you want to even celebrate the work of someone who did those heinous things, did a double murder suicide, right? I feel like I actually do feel like the Chris Benoit story needs to be told. I feel like there needs to be a biopic on this because within the Chris Benoit story, there are many lessons. One of those lessons is that you can be a very, very talented human being and mentally, spiritually, emotionally just not be there, right? You it also tells the story of, mental health, a mental health journey, a man grieving his best friend, um, passing away, um, the wear and tear of pro wrestling on your body, specifically like when you're on the when you this man's finishing move. His finishing move was a diving headbutt. This man got on top of a rope and said, "You know what? I'm gonna land on your head
He did it
with
off
my
of
head."
steel cages, off of ladders,
All of the
like,
ladders, and he was doing. And this is, mind you, he was doing TV and live shows, so he's doing this move 300 times a year.
and chair shots to the head were still a thing.
So this is another thing to tell the story, kind of talk about CTE. I feel like there's so many layers to the Chris Benoit story, and I feel like the story needs to be told because it needs to be shown how a talented person can go through so many unfortunate things that can affect others. And if you tell that story, I feel like there is going to be an instance or a world where men are going to see themselves in Chris Benoit and then try to take another path, right? Because I feel like there's so many things in that story that a lot of men can relate to, right? Like as we get older, we're going to lose important people in our life. And if, Chris Benoit didn't, I don't want to say he grieved incorrectly, but he grieved in a way that was destructive. And so sometimes seeing the destruction in someone's grief can at least encourage you to be like, well, I can't control how I feel in the face of loss, but I can control how I respond and how I act. And if these are the things that are going to set off these triggers that are going to allow me to go down this path, I'm not going to do it anymore. If a Chris Benoit biopic leads to that type of logic and thinking, I think it's more than worth it because you're teaching people, like you said, you're educating people on what not to do. And I feel like that's just as big of a part of life than knowing what to do, is knowing what not to do and knowing what road not to take and knowing what triggers and things to stay away from. But that's like my personal thing on it. Also, but I do think that if there is another wrestling biopic that's done within the next 10 years, it needs to be on Eddie Guerrero. Point blank period. Like I think that Chris should have one, but I feel like Eddie needs one first, and A24 needs to.
You think Vince McMahon's gonna get one?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my God.
That's gonna be a lot to unpack. That's gonna be a long.
That's gonna be so much.
That's gonna be parts.
That's a Passion of the Christ length biopic, is Vince McMahon's biopic. But let us know in the comments below, do you believe that Chris Benoit should have a biopic? But we're gonna move on to the next subject.